The Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, commonly abbreviated as rsha, began not as a battlefield unit, but as a small guard formation tied personally to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Its evolution from a protective detachment into a division-sized combat formation reflects the broader transformation of the SS from a party security organization into a military force with major operational roles. It also reflects the internal politics of the Third Reich, where competing institutions sought prestige, resources, and influence. The Leibstandarte's history cannot be separated from that context, and it cannot be described accurately without addressing both its combat employment and its involvement in ideological violence and war crimes. The roots of the unit lie in the early consolidation of Nazi power. After Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, the regime prioritized loyal armed formations that were directly tied to the party leadership and not fully dependent on the traditional state institutions. The Schutzstaffel or SS under Heinrich Himmler expanded rapidly and aimed to become an elite organization defined by political loyalty and racial ideology. Within that expanding system, a special guard unit was formed to protect Hitler personally. This formation was initially small, selected for loyalty, physical standards, and the political identity that the regime wanted to project. Over time, as Hitler's public appearances increased, and as the regime's sense of threat remained high, the guard detachment became more formalized and more visible. The Leibstandarte's early public function was ceremonial as much as protective. It served as a symbol of the new regime's authority, appearing at rallies and state events and reinforcing the image of a disciplined, loyal, and distinct elite. The unit's members were expected to embody Nazi ideals of obedience and commitment. This early role created a reputation for privileged access and proximity to power. It also created internal incentives. A unit attached to Hitler attracted attention, and attention produced political leverage within the SS. Association with the leader was an asset that could be converted into expansion and into claims of elite status. The unit's development accelerated in the mid-1930s as the regime became more confident and as the SS sought a more active role beyond policing and internal security. In 1934, during the purge known as the Night of the Long Knives, SS formations were used to eliminate perceived threats within the Nazi movement, particularly the SA leadership. While the Leibstandarte itself is often mentioned in connection with this period, the key point is that the SS demonstrated its usefulness as an instrument of political violence, and this strengthened Himmler's position and the SS's claim to expanded responsibilities. After 1934, the SS increasingly asserted itself as a state within a state, competing with the army, the police, and party organizations. The creation of armed SS formations, later known as the Waffen-SS, gave the Leibstandarte a path from guard duty to military operations. The process involved training, organization, and a gradual shift in identity. Leaders within the SS argued that politically reliable troops could fight as effectively as the traditional army and could serve as a force that was directly aligned with Nazi goals. The Wehrmacht leadership resisted this in principle, because it threatened the army's monopoly on organized armed force. However, Hitler encouraged institutional competition and often supported the SS when it suited his political objectives. The result was a parallel military formation that grew alongside the army, drawing manpower and resources while remaining tied to the SS command structure and to the ideological mission of the regime. The Leibstandarte's early military employment occurred in the atmosphere of German expansion before the full outbreak of all World War, during the annexation of Austria in 1938 and the occupation of Czechoslovak territories. S units participated in demonstrations of force and in security tasks. These operations were not major battles, but they provided experience in movement, organization, and the exercise of authority in occupied areas. They also reinforced the message that the SS was part of Germany's national expansion. For members of the Leibstandarte, such operations combined the prestige of being close to Hitler with the sense of being an instrument of a historic mission, as the regime presented it. When war began in 1939, the Leibstandarte entered the field as a motorized infantry regiment rather than as a large independent formation. It was used in Poland and then in Western Europe in 1940. In these early campaigns, the unit fought as part of larger army structures, often under army command arrangements. Because the Wehrmacht still controlled the operational framework, its combat record included actions that were tactically effective in certain engagements. But it also exposed the limitations of a rapidly expanded formation that lacked the long professional traditions of the army. The Waffen-SS in general had to prove itself in the eyes of the military establishment. That pressure to prove elite status contributed to a culture that valued aggression and risk-taking, sometimes at high cost. The campaign in the West in 1940 brought the Leibstandarte into faster-moving operations and into an environment in which propaganda celebrated rapid victories. The unit's image was cultivated as a symbol of SS combat capability and loyalty. Yet the same period also saw severe violations of the laws of war by elements of Waffen-SS formations, including the killing of prisoners of war in some incidents. These events were part of a broader pattern in which ideological hostility, dehumanization, and harsh discipline created conditions for atrocities. The Leibstandarte became associated with such crimes as well, and its history must include that association. War crimes were not accidents detached from the unit's identity. They were linked to the political nature of the SS and to the regime's broader conduct of war. As Germany turned east in 1941, the Leibstandarte participated in operations in the Balkans and then in the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Balkan campaign involved rapid movement and the occupation of territories where resistance and reprisals became a feature of German control. In the Soviet Union, the war escalated into a conflict shaped by ideology and annihilation. The Eastern Front was not merely a military contest. It was also a space where German occupation policy involved mass violence, exploitation, and the persecution of civilians, including Jews. Waffen-SS formations operated within that environment and were implicated in the wider system of repression. The Leibstandarte's role on the front lines cannot be divorced from the context in which rear-area violence and anti-partisan warfare were conducted, often with extreme brutality. In military terms, the Eastern Front posed a different challenge from earlier campaigns. Distances were vast, supply lines stretched, and Soviet resistance remained strong even after early encirclements. The Leibstandarte fought in major operations and endured the same pressures faced by other German formations: attrition, weather, and the gradual erosion of early advantages. As the war continued, the Waffen-SS expanded into divisions, and the Leibstandarte grew into a brigade, and then a division-sized formation. This expansion changed its composition. Early recruitment standards, which emphasized selective entry, became harder to maintain as casualties rose and the demand for replacements increased. The unit retained a reputation for being favored in equipment allocations at certain times, but it also faced the realities of a war of attrition in which even elite designations could not prevent heavy losses. Leadership played a significant role in shaping the unit's development and reputation. Sepp Dietrich, a longtime Hitler loyalist, commanded the Leibstandarte through much of its early expansion. Dietrich was valued for loyalty and for his ability to represent the SS's claim to military legitimacy. His background was not that of a traditional professional officer, and this was sometimes reflected in controversies over competence and discipline. Yet he also embodied the SS model of command, political reliability combined with aggressive posture. Under such leadership, the unit's identity remained closely tied to Hitler personally, even as it grew into a large formation that functioned within broader operational plans. By 1942 and 1943, the Leibstandarte was increasingly deployed as part of the SS Panzer Corps structure that included other Waffen-SS divisions. This reflected a shift in how the regime used the Waffen-SS as a mobile reserve, often committed to stabilize crises or to spearhead offensives. The unit participated in major operations in the East and later in the West. One of the most prominent engagements was the Battle of Kursk in 1943, where German forces attempted to regain initiative through a large offensive. Waffen-SS panzer formations were heavily involved. The battle did not produce the decisive breakthrough Germany sought, and it became a costly demonstration of how the Soviet Union had learned to prepare deep defenses and to deploy reserves effectively. For the Leibstandarte, Kursk exemplified both its tactical role as a heavily equipped formation and the strategic reality that German offensives were increasingly constrained. After Kursk, the strategic balance shifted further. German forces were pushed back, and mobile formations were often used in defensive battles, counterattacks, and withdrawals. The Leibstandarte's movement between fronts reflected the regime's need to plug gaps and respond to Allied pressure. In this period, the unit also became more deeply linked to the Waffen-SS institutional identity, which combined claims of elite military status with the SS's ideological framework. It is in these years that post-war narratives often began. Veterans and sympathetic writers emphasized battlefield performance, while critics emphasized criminality and ideology. A factual account must keep both dimensions in view and recognize that combat effectiveness does not erase involvement in a system that committed crimes. In 1944, the unit was sent to the Western Front, including participation in fighting in Normandy after the Allied landings. The Western theater imposed different conditions: Allied air superiority, dense artillery, and a front that was increasingly dominated by material advantage. German formations, including Waffen-SS divisions, suffered heavy losses under constant attack and struggled to move by day. The Leibstandarte fought as part of efforts to contain Allied advances, and later withdrew as the front collapsed in France and Belgium during this period. Incidents involving the killing of prisoners occurred in the context of German retreat and intensifying brutality, including the well-known massacre of American prisoners near Malmedy during the Ardennes offensive. Elements of the Leibstandarte's associated formations were implicated, and post-war trials addressed these events. Such incidents reinforce that the unit's record cannot be treated purely as a conventional military history. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 represented Germany's last major attempt to alter the strategic situation in the West through a sudden blow. Waffen-SS panzer formations were used in spearhead roles, reflecting Hitler's continued reliance on ideologically trusted units for major operations. The offensive failed for multiple reasons: fuel shortages, Allied resistance, weather changes that restored Allied air power, and the overall imbalance of resources. The Leibstandarte's involvement demonstrated how the regime continued to seek operational miracles, even when the strategic situation was collapsing. The unit's movements in the Ardennes also produced some of the most scrutinized episodes of the Waffen-SS in the West, reinforcing the lasting association between these formations and criminal conduct. As Germany's situation deteriorated into 1945, the Leibstandarte was redeployed again, including to Hungary and later toward Austria, as the regime attempted to defend remaining territory and protect access to vital resources. In these final months, coherence broke down across the German military system. Fuel was scarce, replacements were inadequate, and command structures were strained. Units that had once been considered elite were often reduced to fragments, combining remnants, new recruits, and exhausted veterans. The unit's end-of-war experience was therefore defined less by grand operations than by retreat, defensive actions, and efforts to surrender to Western forces, rather than fall into Soviet hands. This pattern was common among German formations in the final phase, and it reflected widespread fear of Soviet captivity and retaliation after years of brutal war in the East. The Leibstandarte's post-war legacy is closely linked to the legal and moral reckoning that followed Germany's defeat. The Waffen-SS as an organization was declared criminal at Nuremberg, with attention to its role in enforcing Nazi policies and committing war crimes. Individual responsibility varied, but the institutional connection to the SS system was central. Former members of Waffen-SS divisions, including the Leibstandarte, were investigated and, in some cases, prosecuted for specific crimes. At the same time, post-war memory politics, especially in West Germany and in veteran circles, produced narratives that attempted to separate soldiers from politics. Those narratives often emphasized battlefield sacrifice while minimizing or denying crimes. A historically grounded account must treat those post-war narratives as part of the story, not as neutral truth. The unit's evolution also illustrates how personal loyalty to Hitler was institutionalized. A guard detachment that began as a symbol of personal protection became a large combat formation, and its name itself tied its identity to the leader. This naming was not decorative. It signaled that the unit's legitimacy came from proximity to Hitler and from membership in the SS's ideological order. As the Waffen-SS grew, it recruited beyond the early corps and absorbed foreign volunteers and conscripts in other formations. The Leibstandarte remained more closely associated with the German corps and with the leadership's prestige. That prestige influenced equipment allocations and deployment decisions, but it also meant that the unit was used in politically important roles, including high-profile offensives where the regime wanted dramatic results. In practical military terms, the Leibstandarte's growth from regiment to division involved changes in organization, equipment, and function. Motorization increased mobility and allowed rapid redeployment. The addition of armored components and heavy weapons increased striking power, but also increased logistical demands. A panzer division required fuel, spare parts, and trained crews, and it depended on communications and coordination across combined arms. Over time, the unit's ability to operate as a coherent division depended on the training system and on the replacement pipeline. As the war went on and Germany's resources declined, maintaining that coherence became harder. The elite label became a claim that the system struggled to sustain materially. The Leibstandarte's history also serves as a case study in how ideology and military identity interact. The SS cultivated a self-image of elite status, discipline, and political certainty. This self-image could motivate courage and cohesion, but it could also encourage contempt for enemies and for legal restraint. In a total war environment, such contempt could translate into criminal behavior, especially when leadership signals and institutional culture tolerated or encouraged brutality. The Waffen-SS was not simply a military organization with an attached political label. It was an arm of a regime that pursued racial war and political terror. The Leibstandarte, as one of the most prominent Waffen-SS formations, was deeply embedded in that reality. When discussing the unit's evolution, it is therefore necessary to avoid simplifications. It was not a straight line of increasing professionalism from guard duty to modern armored warfare. Nor was it only a sequence of crimes. It was a formation whose prestige and combat role expanded because it served the regime's internal politics and propaganda needs, and because it could be used as a mobile force in operational crises. Its members fought in major battles, suffered heavy casualties, and contributed to German military operations. At the same time, the unit's institutional identity and the environment in which it operated linked it to a system of occupation and violence that produced atrocities. Both aspects are historically true and must be held together to understand what the Leibstandarte was and why it mattered. By the end of the war, the Leibstandarte's transformation was complete in formal terms. It had become a division-level formation with armored elements and a reputation shaped by both battlefield actions and criminal episodes. Yet, the collapse of the Third Reich stripped away the political structure that had created the unit in the first place. What remained were survivors, documents, and competing post-war narratives. The historical record, including wartime reports and post-war investigations, shows a formation that served as a highly visible example of the Waffen-SS's rise and of the costs of militarizing an ideological guard. The Leibstandart's evolution is therefore a story of institutional ambition, political loyalty, modern warfare, and moral collapse, all tightly intertwined in the broader history of Nazi Germany's war. The unit's relationship with the regular army remained a constant source of tension. Wehrmacht officers often regarded Waffen-SS formations as politically favored competitors whose existence threatened traditional military authority. In some cases, army commanders praised Waffen-SS units for aggressive performance. In other cases, they criticized them for indiscipline, high casualties, or unreliable staff work. These mixed judgments were partly a reflection of reality and partly a reflection of institutional rivalry. For the Leibstandart, being under scrutiny reinforced the pressure to prove elite status, which could lead to audacious attacks and a refusal to withdraw when a more cautious formation might have conserved strength. Such patterns were not unique to the SS, but they were intensified by propaganda and by the unit's symbolic connection to Hitler. The evolution of recruitment standards offers another concrete way to track change. Early selection emphasized strict physical criteria and political vetting, and membership carried social prestige inside the Nazi system. As casualties mounted and the Waffen-SS expanded, the pool of suitable volunteers shrank, and the regime relied increasingly on broader recruitment and, in the wider Waffen-SS, on foreign volunteers and conscripts. The Leibstandarte maintained a core identity connected to the early SS, but it too absorbed replacements who had less time for ideological formation and less attachment to the original guard culture. This did not necessarily reduce brutality. It altered the internal cohesion and the nature of discipline. In large wartime formations, discipline is often maintained through routine, exhaustion, and peer pressure rather than through ideological conviction alone. The question of personal guard also changed in practical terms. Once the unit became a field formation, it could not protect Hitler in a literal day-to-day sense. Hitler's security was handled by multiple layers of guards, police, and SS units in Berlin and at headquarters. The Leibstandart's name continued to carry symbolic meaning, and its veterans continued to claim a special status. But the unit's main function became combat employment. The retention of the name served propaganda. It connected frontline action to the leader's image and implied that his personal chosen men were at the decisive points of the war. This messaging helped the SS compete for recruits and resources, and it helped the regime present battlefield commitment as proof of political legitimacy. After 1945, efforts by former Waffen-SS members to normalize their service often focused on the idea that they fought as soldiers, separate from SS crimes. In the case of the Leibstandarte, this separation is historically difficult to sustain, not because every member committed crimes, but because the unit was part of an organization that integrated political policing, ideological selection, and military force. Post-war organizations and memoir literature sometimes promoted selective remembrance, emphasizing battlefield episodes while minimizing evidence from investigations and trials. Historians treat these sources with caution, comparing them to contemporary documentation and to the broader pattern of Waffen-SS conduct. The result is a picture that is neither purely condemnatory nor excusing, but analytical. The Leibstandarte's evolution shows how a regime can convert personal security forces into instruments of war, and how prestige and ideology can travel with them into the battlefield and into occupation. This is why the Leibstandarte remains a frequent subject in modern accounts of the Second World War. It sits at the intersection of spectacle and structure, a unit created for display and loyalty that became a mobile fighting formation. and a fighting formation whose institutional DNA remained tied to a political project of domination and exclusion. Its combat deployments can be traced across the map of Europe, but its meaning is found in the way the SS fused military power with ideology. The unit's evolution is therefore not only a military chronology. It is evidence of how the Nazi state reshaped institutions to serve both war and terror, and how those institutions carried that fusion to the end.